The Curious Case of Mr. Jabez Wilson. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings in London when the air felt sharp, and the fire at 221B Baker Street crackled with welcome warmth. Dr. Watson had stopped by to visit Holmes, who sat in his armchair, fingers steepled, eyes closed, not asleep, but thinking. Without opening his eyes, Holmes said, "Watson, you're not wearing your medical gloves this morning." Watson smiled. "How could you possibly know that?" Holmes opened one eye. "You rubbed your right hand just now, the way you do when it's slightly cold." A man who owns gloves but chooses not to wear them reveals as much as one who does. Before Watson could reply, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a tray. Holmes read it aloud. Mr. Jabez Wilson, pawnbroker, Coburg Square. He looked up. "Watson, this might amuse you. The case of the red-headed man." Moments later, a stout man with fiery red hair and an anxious expression entered the room. He bowed awkwardly and sat down. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he began, "it's about a league, a red-headed league. I joined it, got paid well for doing nothing at all, and now it's vanished. Overnight." Holmes leaned forward, instantly intrigued. "You were paid to do nothing?" Mr. Wilson nodded. 8 weeks, £4 a week, just for copying from the encyclopedia 4 hours a day. Then one day I arrived, and the door was locked. A sign said, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved." Just like that. Watson blinked. "And you have no idea why?" "None at all," said Wilson, "but I have a feeling something wasn't right." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "A most singular case," he murmured. "Tell me everything, slowly, from the beginning." A job too easy. Mr. Jabez Wilson settled deeper into the chair, adjusting his vest nervously as Holmes and Watson leaned forward. "It all began," he said, "with an advertisement in the Morning Chronicle." He reached into his coat and unfolded a small clipping. Holmes read it aloud. "To the Red-Headed League, vacancies now open for men with red hair. Apply in person at 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, between 11 and 2. Watson raised an eyebrow. "That's specific." Wilson nodded. "It caught my assistant's eye, Vincent Spaulding. Bright young fellow, said my hair was perfect for it, insisted I go." Holmes asked, "What sort of work do you do, Mr. Wilson?" "I run a small pawnbroker shop in Coburg Square," he said. "Not much business these days, so a few extra pounds seemed a blessing." He continued, "I went to the address. Place was packed with the red-headed men, but somehow I was selected." Holmes's fingers drummed softly. "And your duties?" Wilson smiled awkwardly. "Simple. I had to sit in a small office and copy the Encyclopedia Britannica. 4 hours a day, no distractions, no excuses, from 10 to 2, each day for 8 weeks. Watson frowned. "And they paid you?" Wilson nodded. £4 a week, in gold, on time, every Saturday. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "What happened when it ended?" Wilson's face dropped. "I arrived Monday morning. The office was locked. A sign on the door said, 'The Red-Headed League is dissolved.' No forwarding address, no contact, gone." He looked at Holmes, pleading. "I don't understand what I was really doing, but I think I was being used, and I want to know why." Holmes stood, eyes bright. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "you've been part of something far more clever than you realize." The strange assistant. Sherlock Holmes paced the length of the sitting room, hands behind his back, eyes distant. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "tell me more about this assistant, Vincent Spaulding." Wilson perked up. "Smart fellow, works for half wages but sharp as a tack, always fiddling with chemicals and photography in the cellar. A bit strange, maybe, but loyal." Holmes stopped pacing. Did you ever inspect that cellar? Wilson blinked. Well, no, it's his own space. He said he uses it to develop photographs. Holmes turned to Watson. And while Mr. Wilson was copying encyclopedia pages upstairs, Spaulding had 4 uninterrupted hours in the shop every day for 8 weeks. Watson frowned. What could he be doing? Holmes smiled slightly. That, my dear Watson, is what we intend to find out. He turned back to Wilson. You've been most helpful. I'd like to pay a visit to your shop, just as a curious customer. Within the hour, Holmes and Watson arrived discreetly at Coburg Square. Wilson's shop sat quietly between a tobacconist and a newspaper stall. Holmes circled the block slowly, noting the alleyways, nearby buildings, and especially the bank that sat just behind the block, City and Suburban Bank. They entered the shop. Spaulding, short, smartly dressed with a smudge of dirt on his trouser knee, welcomed them politely. Looking for a watch, sir? Holmes nodded, examining the wares. Then he asked casually, Been in business long? Some years, Spaulding replied. Not much excitement here. Holmes smiled. Indeed. But as they left, Holmes whispered to Watson. His trousers, Watson, worn at the knees. That man has been digging. Watson's eyes widened. Digging? Holmes nodded. Yes, and I believe I know exactly where the tunnel leads. The tunnel beneath the city. As they left the pawn shop, Holmes's mood shifted from casual curiosity to razor-sharp focus. Watson, he said quietly, this was never about red hair. It was about time and space. Watson struggled to keep up as Holmes walked briskly down the street. They created the Red-Headed League, Holmes continued, as a distraction, to get Mr. Wilson out of his shop for hours every day. While he copied encyclopedia entries upstairs, Spaulding, who was no ordinary assistant, had access to the cellar, unbothered, unwatched. Watson blinked. But to what end? Holmes stopped at the corner and pointed to the grand building behind the shop. The City and Suburban Bank backs directly onto Wilson's property. There's no question now. They're tunneling beneath the shop, straight toward the vault. Watson exhaled. A robbery. Holmes nodded. A carefully planned one. The tunnel must be nearly complete, and with the leak dissolved, there's no need to keep Wilson away anymore. The job is done. They returned to Baker Street, where Holmes sent urgent notes to Scotland Yard and Mr. Merriweather, the bank director. By evening, the plan was in place. Holmes turned to Watson. Tonight, we lay in wait at the bank's vault. The robbery will happen after dark, when the streets are still and the tunnel is complete. Watson checked his revolver. You expect them to come through tonight? Holmes smiled. If I were them, I would not wait another day. He leaned back, folding his arms. A fake league, a forged job, and an invisible tunnel. It's one of the most audacious crimes London has ever seen. Watson asked, and what if they sense a trap? Holmes stood, eyes gleaming. Then we'll let them spring it anyway. Waiting in the vault. That night, under cover of darkness, Holmes, Watson, and 2 Scotland Yard officers, along with Mr. Merriweather from the bank, gathered in the basement vault of the City and Suburban Bank. The room was stone-walled, cool, and silent, filled with the faint metallic scent of coin and dust. In the center stood a large stack of wooden crates, gold reserve, according to Merriweather. Holmes extinguished the lantern. The room dropped into blackness. We wait in silence, Holmes whispered. They'll come from the floor, through the tunnel, likely armed. We must be ready. Watson's grip tightened on his revolver. The minutes dragged. Watson could hear only the ticking of a pocket watch, the soft breath of men in the dark, and somewhere distant, the muffled clatter of horses above. Then, a faint scraping. It came from beneath the crates. Holmes raised a hand. No one moved. The scraping grew louder. Then came a muffled thud. Boards shifted. A faint glimmer of light pierced between cracks. Suddenly, a slab of stone lifted. A hand emerged. Then a head. It was Spaulding, though now Watson saw clearly this was no assistant. It was a criminal. Behind him, another figure followed, thin, wiry, with a cloth sack slung over his shoulder. Both men climbed silently into the vault, unaware of the shadows around them. Then Holmes struck a match. "Now, gentlemen," he cried. The lantern blazed. Watson and the officers surged forward. There was shouting, a brief struggle, but it was over in moments. The men were bound, defeated. Spaulding scowled but said nothing. His partner trembled with rage. Mr. Merriweather stepped forward, pale. "Good heavens," he muttered, "they were inches from the gold." Holmes smiled calmly. "And now, Mr. Merriweather, your vault is safe, and the League of Red-Headed Men has served its purpose." The man called Clay. The next morning at Baker Street, sunlight filtered gently through the curtains. Holmes sat comfortably with a newspaper in one hand and a cup of tea in the other, as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a routine puzzle. Watson entered, still somewhat stunned. "They were so close," he said. "If we had arrived a day later—" Holmes nodded. "Then London's banking system would be in chaos." He folded the newspaper and tapped the headline. "Attempted bank robbery, foiled notorious criminal arrested." Watson read aloud. "John Clay, also known as Vincent Spaulding." Holmes smiled. "One of the cleverest criminals in London. Well-educated, well-connected, a master of disguise. And now, caught." Watson sat down. "How did you know? The advertisement, the copying job? It was all so bizarre." Holmes leaned forward. "That's what made it obvious. A fake job, created solely to get Mr. Wilson out of the shop. No company pays good wages for copying an encyclopedia, unless they're hiding something." "The tunnel?" Watson said. "Exactly," Holmes replied. 8 weeks of uninterrupted digging. 4 hours a day, a shop that backs onto a bank. A young man with dirt on his knees and chemistry experiments in the cellar. It all pointed to one thing. Watson shook his head, impressed. "And the Red-Headed League?" Holmes chuckled. "A brilliant ruse, absurd enough to be believed, and once they'd finished digging, they closed the League and prepared the robbery." Watson looked thoughtful. "And Mr. Wilson?" Holmes nodded. "An innocent pawn in a grand game." He stood and poured another cup of tea. "All in a day's work, Watson, though I must say this was one of the more colorful schemes I've seen." The most absurd case. Later that afternoon, Holmes lounged once again in his favorite armchair, violin resting nearby, eyes half closed in reflection. Watson sat opposite him, still chuckling softly. "I must admit," he said, "this case, it's almost comical, a fake league for red-headed men." Holmes opened one eye. "It's precisely that absurdity which gave it away." Watson leaned forward. "But how many people would have thought to question it, the ad, the office, the job, all so elaborate?" Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, it had no purpose beyond creating a distraction. You see, when a criminal is clever, he hides behind something ridiculous, because no one suspects what sounds foolish." Watson laughed. "Like hiding a diamond in a loaf of bread." "Exactly," Holmes said. He picked up his violin and drew the bow across the strings once, letting the note linger. John Clay knew how to use spectacle. He understood psychology, But what he didn't count on was an old pawnbroker with a curious assistant stumbling into my hands. Watson asked, "Do you think Clay will escape again?" Holmes shook his head. "Not likely. Scotland Yard has him now, and this time the evidence is quite literally dug into the ground." Watson flipped through his notebook. "I think this case deserves to be written down." Holmes gave a small nod. "As long as you emphasize one thing." "What's that?" Holmes looked over the rim of his teacup. "That crime can wear many disguises, but logic will always find its face." A method in madness. As the day faded into evening, Watson remained in the sitting room, notebook open, pen poised. He had begun to write the case of the Red-Headed League, but paused after the first few lines. He looked up at Holmes, who was now adjusting the strings of his violin with care. "Holmes," Watson said, "you've solved murders, thefts, disappearances, but this one feels different." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter, stranger, almost humorous, and yet beneath it, something much darker." Holmes smiled. "Because it reveals a truth few understand. Crime is not always born of desperation. Sometimes it's born of intelligence twisted to selfish ends." He set the violin aside and walked to the window. "Clay is a man of talent, but wasted talent. He used his gifts to deceive rather than to build." Watson jotted a few words, then looked up again. "And your methods, Holmes? You saw what no one else did. What makes you different?" Holmes turned, his expression neutral. "I observe. I detach emotion. I reduce confusion to fact." Watson nodded slowly. "You make the extraordinary logical." Holmes gave a slight bow. "And that, dear Watson, is the heart of deduction." He picked up a small piece of paper, the advertisement from the Red-Headed League, and handed it to Watson. "Frame that," Holmes said, "as a reminder that the strangest things often hide the greatest truths." Watson smiled, tapping his pen against his notes. "And I shall begin this case," he said, "with the sentence, 'It all began with a man who had very red hair.'" Holmes laughed softly. "A very good beginning indeed." Of hair and humanity. Watson's pen moved steadily as he shaped the curious tale of red hair, fake leagues, and underground crime into something coherent, almost literary. Across the room, Holmes lay sprawled on the settee, eyes closed, hands folded. Watson read aloud from his draft. Mr. Jabez Wilson was not a man accustomed to mystery. His only crime had been possessing an unusually vivid shade of red hair. Holmes opened one eye. "Charming." Watson smiled. "It's hard to make pawnbroking, copywork, and tunnel digging sound elegant." Holmes sat up. "But that is the beauty of it, simplicity masking complexity. A fake job, a rented office, an honest man used as a decoy. It is a comedy, Watson, but one with sharp edges." Watson closed his notebook. "Do you often find humor in crime?" Holmes stood and poured tea. "Only when the criminal has a sense of flair. Clay was audacious. He nearly succeeded, not by brute force, but by intellect." He sipped his tea. "And yet," he added, "a flaw in timing undid him." Watson leaned forward. "And if Wilson had stayed home?" Holmes smiled. "Then the vault would be empty, the tunnel sealed, and Clay gone forever." He gestured toward the ceiling. "But fate favors the curious." Watson laughed. "You mean yourself?" Holmes shrugged modestly. "I simply follow patterns others ignore." He picked up the Morning Chronicle again. "And in the end, the League of Red-Headed Men vanishes, as it was meant to, like smoke." Watson looked thoughtful. "And poor Mr. Wilson?" Holmes smirked. We'll go back to pawning umbrellas and ticking clocks, and perhaps look more closely at job offers involving hair color. The absurdity of crime. Holmes and Watson sat before the fire, the remains of dinner cleared, the evening paper folded neatly on the table. Watson looked up from his notes. You often say that criminals rely on the stupidity of the public. Holmes nodded. And they're not wrong to do so. He stood, pacing slowly. The success of the Red-Headed League depended entirely on how ridiculous it sounded, and in being ridiculous, it became invisible. Watson raised an eyebrow. You think absurdity is a kind of camouflage? Indeed, Holmes replied. The world expects evil to wear a mask of darkness. It forgets that the brightest paint can hide the deepest cracks. He gestured toward Watson's notebook. A man lured away by a job too good to be true. A gang digging under London's streets. All made possible because no one thought to ask, why red hair? Watson tapped his pen thoughtfully. And what lesson would you have the world learn from this? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then he said, that attention to detail is not a gift, it's a discipline. Most people see, but they do not observe. He turned toward the window, peering into the gaslit street below. And most crimes are not hidden by genius, but by noise. Watson smiled. That would make a good line. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. Then write it down. He resumed his seat and poured another cup of tea. Life, he said, is a series of puzzles, Watson. Most people walk past them. I prefer to stop and solve a few. Watson nodded quietly, and the fire crackled on. Of reputations and results. Watson's pen scratched steadily across the page, nearing the end of the case summary. Holmes reclined nearby, long fingers steepled, his eyes closed, but Watson knew better than to assume he wasn't listening. I've titled it The Red-Headed League, Watson said. Holmes smirked without opening his eyes. An excellent choice, memorable, curious, misleading. Misleading? Watson asked. Holmes sat up, stretching. The League was never real. It existed only to distract, but in the minds of those who read your account it will be the headline, the center of the mystery. He stood and moved to the window, watching the flickering gaslight on Baker Street. Such is the danger of storytelling. The truth becomes background to the spectacle. Watson closed his notebook gently. And yet, you allow me to write these tales. Holmes turned, his voice calm. Because you report the outcome, even if you dress it in flair, and because the public's imagination must be fed, better with cleverness than fear. Watson chuckled. So, it's not about glory? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Glory is for politicians. I prefer clarity. He walked to the fireplace and tapped the mantel once. In the end, the bank was protected. John Clay is in custody. Mr. Wilson returns to his harmless shop. And London continues, unaware it nearly lost its gold reserve to a man with a shovel and a false name. Watson added one final line to his manuscript. And Sherlock Holmes, once again, saw the invisible. Holmes gave a small nod. Publish it, Watson. But do give the credit to the League. I rather enjoy the idea that red hair once fooled the entire city. The case closes. A few days later, the case was already drifting into the background of London's endless noise. The newspapers had moved on. The public, never short on curiosity but always lacking memory, had already forgotten the name Jabez Wilson. But in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, the red-haired pawnbroker still occupied a space, not in reality but in reflection. Watson sat by the window, final pages of his manuscript folded neatly in his lap. "This one will amuse readers," he said, "but I wonder if they'll understand the elegance of it." Holmes, busy dusting chemicals from a microscope slide, replied without looking up. "They won't, but that's fine. The value of a case doesn't lie in how loud it was, it lies in how nearly it was missed." He paused, then added, "and how well it was seen." Watson looked down at the title on the front page. "The Adventure of the Red-Headed League." He smiled. "A strange story," he said, "of hair, deception, and a tunnel." Holmes finally turned, dusting his hands. "A strange world," he replied, "full of small doors, hiding very large secrets." The sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs. Another client, another case. Holmes straightened his jacket, already shifting gears. "No rest for the observant," he muttered. As the door opened, Watson tucked away his notes. He knew the story would live on, not because of the headline, but because of the man behind it. Sherlock Holmes, who could take the absurd, the overlooked, the invisible, and make it truth. And with that, the League was forgotten. But the legend had grown.